The rain hammered against the windows of St. Mary's Hospital as Sarah clutched her swollen belly, each contraction stealing her breath away. At 23, she had imagined this moment differently, with her boyfriend Marcus holding her hand, whispering words of encouragement. Instead, she sat alone in the sterile waiting room, her phone displaying 17 unanswered calls to his number. The harsh fluorescent lights cast shadows under her eyes, highlighting the exhaustion that had nothing to do with labor pains. Her water had broken 3 hours ago while she was stocking shelves at the grocery store where she worked part-time. The manager had reluctantly called her a taxi, muttering about the inconvenience. Now, as another wave of pain crashed over her, Sarah pressed her back against the uncomfortable plastic chair and tried to remember the breathing exercises from the prenatal classes she'd attended alone. The automatic doors whooshed open, bringing with them the scent of expensive cologne and the soft click of Italian leather shoes against linoleum. Sarah barely glanced up, too focused on managing her pain, to notice the tall figure in the perfectly tailored charcoal suit who had just entered the hospital's maternity wing. Alexander Hawthorne adjusted his platinum cufflinks as he strode through the hospital corridor, his mind still buzzing from the board meeting that had run impossibly late. At 41, he had built a business empire worth $300 million, but tonight he was simply a man keeping a promise to his assistant's daughter, to be present for the birth of his goddaughter. The familiar weight of responsibility pressed on his shoulders, though this time it felt different, more personal. He had never wanted children of his own. His world of hostile takeovers, international deals and corporate warfare left no room for the softness that children required. Yet something about tonight felt significant, as if the universe was trying to tell him something he wasn't ready to hear. As he rounded the corner toward the maternity ward, a sound stopped him in his tracks. A quiet whimper of pain, vulnerable and raw. Years of business negotiations had taught him to read people, to notice details others missed. This wasn't just physical discomfort. This was the sound of someone facing their greatest challenge utterly alone. Alexander's steel-grey eyes found the source, a young woman with auburn hair escaping from a messy ponytail. Her hands pressed against her belly, tears streaming down her face as she tried to muffle her cries. Sarah felt the contraction building like a tsunami, starting as a dull ache and crescendoing into agony that made her vision blur. She bit down on her lip to keep from screaming, tasting copper as she drew blood. The nurse had told her it wasn't time yet, that she needed to wait, but her body seemed to have other plans. Every instinct screamed that something was wrong, that this baby was coming whether the medical staff was ready or not. Through her haze of pain, she became aware of someone approaching, not the hurried shuffle of overworked hospital staff, but measured, confident steps. A shadow fell across her, and she looked up to see a man who seemed to belong in a boardroom rather than a hospital waiting room. His dark hair was perfectly styled despite the late hour, and his suit probably cost more than she made in 6 months. "Excuse me." His voice was deep, cultured, with the kind of authority that suggested he was accustomed to being heard. "Are you all right?" Sarah wanted to laugh at the absurdity of the question, but another contraction hit her, doubling her over. When she could speak again, her voice came out as a whisper. "Do I look all right?" The stranger's expression softened, and something flickered in his eyes that she couldn't identify. Concern, recognition. Whatever it was, it made her feel less invisible than she had in months. Alexander had seen suffering before, in the faces of employees he'd had to lay off, in the eyes of competitors he'd driven to bankruptcy. But this was different. This woman's pain was pure, unguarded, stripped of all pretense. It reminded him of something he'd spent decades trying to forget, his own mother, laboring alone while his father closed another business deal in Tokyo, too important to be interrupted for something as mundane as birth. "When did your contractions start?" he asked, crouching down to her level despite the expensive fabric of his trousers. Sarah looked at him with surprise, as if she couldn't believe this well-dressed stranger was engaging with her crisis. 3 hours ago. The baby isn't due for 2 weeks, but... Another contraction cut off her words, and she gripped the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles went white. Alexander's mind shifted into crisis management mode, the same sharp focus that had saved his company during the 2008 financial crisis. "Where's your partner, your family?" The question hung in the air, and Sarah's face crumpled slightly. "My boyfriend. He said he had something important to do tonight. More important than this, apparently." Her voice broke on the last word, and Alexander felt something twist in his chest, an unfamiliar sensation that took him a moment to recognize as protectiveness. The admission hung between them like a wound exposed to air. Alexander studied her face, young, frightened, but with an underlying strength that reminded him of his grandmother, who had raised 5 children during the Depression without ever losing her dignity. This woman, he corrected himself, was facing the most vulnerable moment of her life with more grace than most people showed during minor inconveniences. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. "Sarah. Sarah Chen." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving streaks of mascara on her pale skin. "I'm sorry, I don't know why I told you that. You probably have somewhere important to be." Alexander glanced at his Rolex, 10:47 p.m. His assistant's daughter wouldn't be delivering for at least another hour, according to the latest update. He had nowhere more important to be than right here, though he couldn't quite explain why. "I'm Alexander," he said, and was surprised by how natural it felt to introduce himself without his title, without the weight of his fortune preceding him. "And right now, the most important thing is making sure you're not facing this alone." Sarah's eyes widened, as if kindness from a stranger was so foreign she couldn't quite process it. Another contraction began building, and without thinking, Alexander reached out and took her hand. The touch was electric, unexpected. Sarah had been bracing herself for another wave of agony, but somehow the warm pressure of this stranger's hand, Alexander's hand, seemed to anchor her to something solid. His fingers were soft, unmarked by manual labor, but his grip was steady and sure. For the first time in hours, she didn't feel like she was drowning. "Breathe with me," Alexander said, his voice taking on a rhythm that reminded her of the meditation apps she'd tried and failed to use. "In through your nose, out through your mouth. You're stronger than this pain." It was absurd. This man in his expensive suit, with his manicured nails and probably 3 advanced degrees, telling her about strength. What could he possibly know about struggle? Yet there was something in his eyes that suggested he understood more than his polished exterior revealed. The contraction peaked and began to recede, leaving Sarah gasping but somehow still upright. "Thank you," she whispered, though she wasn't sure what she was thanking him for, the breathing technique, the human contact, or simply the fact that he hadn't walked away. Alexander didn't release her hand. "How far apart are they coming now?" Sarah checked the timer on her phone, a cracked iPhone 8 that looked ancient compared to the device she glimpsed in Alexander's pocket. "Every 4 minutes. The nurse said to time them, but she hasn't been back to check on me in over an hour." Alexander's jaw tightened. In his world, inefficiency was unacceptable, but medical negligence toward a woman in labor was unconscionable. He stood, his hand still holding Sarah's, and scanned the bustling corridor with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to solving problems. "Stay right here," he said, then paused. "Actually, that's a ridiculous thing to say to someone in labor, isn't it?" Despite everything, Sarah almost smiled. Just a little. Alexander squeezed her hand once, before releasing it. "I'll be right back." She watched him stride down the hallway with the kind of purposeful energy that suggested people usually scrambled to get out of his way. Even here, in a place where money couldn't buy faster dilation or easier delivery, he carried himself like a man who expected results. Within minutes, he returned with a nurse in tow. Not the harried young woman who had checked Sarah in, but an older woman with kind eyes and the bearing of someone in charge. "This is Nurse Patterson," Alexander said. "She's going to take excellent care of you." The nurse immediately began checking Sarah's vitals, her movements efficient but gentle. "How are we doing, honey? Let's get you somewhere more comfortable than this waiting room." As they helped Sarah to her feet, she caught Alexander's eye. "You don't have to stay," she said softly. "I'm sure you have somewhere." "I'm not going anywhere," he said simply. The labor and delivery room was a far cry from the stark waiting area. Soft lighting replaced the harsh fluorescence, and the bed looked infinitely more comfortable than the plastic chairs. Sarah had been given a hospital gown and was now connected to monitors that tracked her baby's heartbeat, a steady, reassuring sound that filled the room like a metronome of hope. Alexander had shed his suit jacket and rolled up his sleeves, looking oddly at home despite being completely out of his element. He sat in the chair beside her bed, and Sarah found herself studying his profile. There were lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled more than his serious demeanor indicated, and a small scar on his chin that hinted at a less polished past. "You don't have to stay," she said again as another contraction began building. It was weaker than the others. The epidural was finally taking effect. "You mentioned that," Alexander replied, his tone gentle but firm. "And I told you, I'm not going anywhere. Besides," he gestured to his phone, "I'm supposed to be here anyway." "My goddaughter is being born down the hall." Sarah's eyebrows rose. "Really? What a coincidence." "I don't believe in coincidences anymore," Alexander said quietly, his eyes meeting hers. "I think we end up exactly where we're supposed to be, even when we don't understand why." As the hours passed, something shifted in the sterile hospital room. Alexander found himself sharing stories he hadn't told anyone, about growing up with absent parents, about building his fortune to prove he was worth more than their indifference, about the loneliness that success couldn't cure. Sarah, in turn, spoke about her dreams of becoming a teacher, about the boyfriend who had promised to change but never did, about her fears of raising a child alone. "I keep thinking I'm not ready," Sarah admitted during a quiet moment between contractions. "I'm 23, I work part-time at a grocery store, and I live in a studio apartment above a laundromat. What kind of life can I give this baby?" Alexander was quiet for a long moment, remembering his own childhood, the mansion that felt empty, the nannies who raised him while his parents built their social empire, the loneliness that money had never been able to cure. "Love," he said finally. "You can give this baby love. Everything else is just details." Sarah turned to look at him, this mysterious man who had appeared in her darkest hour like some kind of guardian angel in an expensive suit. "You sound like you know something about growing up without it." "More than I'd like to admit," Alexander replied, his voice carrying a weight that made Sarah's heart ache for the child he'd once been. At 3:17 a.m., everything changed. The monitors began beeping frantically, and suddenly the room filled with medical staff. Dr. Rodriguez, who had been calm and reassuring all night, now wore an expression of focused concern that made Sarah's blood run cold. "The baby's heart rate is dropping," she explained quickly. "We need to do an emergency C-section. Now." Terror flooded Sarah's system, washing away the artificial calm of the pain medication. "Is my baby okay? Please, you have to tell me." Alexander was on his feet instantly, his hand finding hers. "Look at me, Sarah. Look at me." His voice cut through her panic with absolute authority. "This baby has the strongest mother I've ever met. You're going to get through this. You're both going to be fine." As they wheeled her toward the operating room, Sarah clung to his hand. "Alexander, I'm scared." "I know," he said, keeping pace with the gurney, "but you're not alone. I promise you, you're not alone anymore." At the doors to the OR, they had to stop. Hospital policy. Only family allowed beyond this point. Alexander watched helplessly as they wheeled Sarah away, her frightened eyes locked on his until the doors swung shut between them. Alexander paced the waiting room like a caged animal, his usual composure completely shattered. Somewhere during the night, this stranger's crisis had become his own. He couldn't explain when or how it had happened, only that the thought of losing Sarah or her baby felt like a knife twisting in his chest. His phone buzzed with congratulations messages. His goddaughter had been born 2 hours ago, healthy and perfect. His assistant's family was celebrating down the hall, but Alexander couldn't bring himself to join them. His vigil was here, outside an operating room where a woman he'd known for less than 12 hours was fighting for 2 lives. "Sir?" A soft voice interrupted his pacing. Dr. Rodriguez stood in the doorway, still in her surgical scrubs, a tired but genuine smile on her face. "Sarah is asking for you." Alexander's legs nearly gave out from relief. "She's okay, the baby." Both perfect. It was touch and go for a few minutes, but Sarah's a fighter, and you have a healthy baby girl waiting to meet you. The words hit him like a physical blow. You have a baby girl, as if he belonged there, as if he was family, as if in one night his entire life had been rewritten. Sarah looked impossibly small in the hospital bed, pale but radiant in the way new mothers always seem to be. In her arms, wrapped in a pink blanket, was the tiniest human Alexander had ever seen. Perfect rosebud lips, a button nose, and wisps of dark hair that looked exactly like her mother's. "Alexander," Sarah's voice was hoarse but warm. "I want you to meet someone. This is Grace." He approached the bed carefully, as if sudden movements might shatter the moment. "Grace," he repeated softly. "It's perfect." "I named her after what you gave me tonight," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. "Grace, in my darkest hour, I don't know how to thank you." Alexander reached out tentatively, and Sarah guided his finger into Grace's tiny fist. The baby's grip was surprisingly strong, and something fundamental shifted inside him. A wall he'd spent 41 years building crumbled in an instant. "You don't need to thank me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You both saved me tonight, more than you'll ever know." Sarah studied his face, seeing the vulnerability he usually kept hidden behind boardroom confidence. "What happens now?" Alexander looked down at Grace, then back at Sarah. "Now, you're never alone again. I don't know exactly what that looks like, but I know it's true." 6 months later, Alexander stood in the doorway of a bright nursery, watching Sarah sing softly to Grace during their evening routine. The apartment was modest, but filled with warmth. Family photos, children's books, and toys that spoke of love rather than luxury. He had offered to buy them a house, to set up trust funds, to solve their problems with money the way he solved everything else. Sarah had accepted help with medical bills and childcare, but she'd insisted on building their life together rather than simply being rescued. "She's growing so fast," Sarah said as Alexander entered the room. Grace reached for him immediately, and he scooped her up with the practiced ease of someone who had become essential to her daily routine. Da, Grace babbled, and both adults froze. "That's not... She doesn't mean..." Sarah started, but Alexander was smiling through tears. "I know what she means," he said softly. "And if you'll have me, if you'll both have me, I'd like to make it official." He set Grace gently in her crib and turned to face Sarah, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. "I know this isn't how these things usually happen. We did everything backwards, fell in love during a crisis, became a family before we became a couple. But Sarah, you and Grace are my heart. Will you marry me?" Sarah's answer was lost in tears and kisses, but Grace's delighted giggling seemed to speak for all of them. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin in the most unexpected places, born from moments when strangers choose compassion over convenience, connection over comfort. Thank you for listening to our story about unexpected love, second chances, and the power of showing up when someone needs you most. We'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Tell us where you're listening from and share your own stories of unexpected kindness. Your words mean the world to us, and knowing our story has reached hearts around the globe makes every word worth writing. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most profound changes in our lives come from the simplest acts of human compassion.